The honest truth is it's incompatible to work your socks off without a break, insanely hard for a toxic boss or a faceless employer. Every single generation now questions, is my job bullshit? Well, that's new.
You are probably known as the leading authority on the future of work.
Julia Hobsbawm is one of the world's
top thinkers on the future of work,
advising governments,
businesses, even
Oprah Winfrey used to come to London and we would hang out. I identified 4 phases of work since the Second World War. Next year will be 100 years since the 5-day week. You've actually got these 5 generations working together. If you really treat human workers like drones, they will get sick.
The computer has made its way from the corner of the office to the desktop and now kind of into the pocket.
The office, the building, as more like a hotel space is a trend that's here to stay.
Make sure you subscribe so we can continue to get bigger and bigger guests. Julia, welcome to Jimmy's Jobs of the Future.
Hello, my pleasure to be with you.
What is your job, Julia?
Gosh, I wish I knew. Well, I'm probably on job 27 in my life, as I'm #only 60. So I've done a lot of different jobs. I have a hybrid job, unsurprisingly. I run a business that mixes my own writing, broadcasting, speaking and consulting with a new network business I've started called Workathon. So I'm sort of chief cook and bottle washer of my own life.
And you are probably known as the leading authority on the future of work, right? I've known about you for 10 years plus in this space, and you're a real kind of like thought leader in it. How did you make the decision that this was what you were going to be known for and this was what you were going to spend your career doing?
Well, first of all, compliment accepted, but not completely deserved. And I would actually say, first of all, almost everything in my career, and I think in most people's careers, has been accidental. I think often when people say someone is ambitious, for example, they mistakenly think that there's a linear plan. Actually, I've been known for work really only since 2021, when I wrote a paper that became my book, The Nowhere Office. And that was the moment when all the things I'd been doing up until that time I'd worked in television, I'd worked in politics, I'd run my own PR consultancy, I'd run my own networking consultancy, which is in fact what I was really well known for up until then. I sort of had a light bulb moment, like many people had in their lives during the pandemic. I was promoting a book about simplicity in a complex world, would you believe? So I'd begun to write about how we live and work. I'd begun to focus a lot on technology. So if anything, up until that point, I was fairly well known for networks and to some degree, networks and technology, modern life. But I had this light bulb moment that all the work culture and work problems I'd observed and noted for myself over decades was an insight that it was not going to go back to what it was before. And therefore I wrote this paper that Demos published, that Polly Mackenzie took a punt on, really. And I basically said to her, you know, I just have a hunch that the future of work is going to be the big, big thing, and I'd be happy to write a paper for you. And she said, well, let's make a commission and you can chair it and da-da-da. And so overnight, really, from when it was published in about February 21, that suddenly I was sort of seen as an expert on work, if you see what I mean.
Of course. Was it February 21 or was it earlier? Because
it was February 21, and then the book, The Nowhere Office, came out in 22.
Okay.
So it was a paper first.
Yeah.
And the entrepreneur in me kept the IP.
Yeah.
And the paper was published, and it was, pretty widely picked up on. And then my then book agent sold it into the UK and the US. And then the Nowhere Office book came out in February 2022. And in the intervening period, I was already then writing and doing my own podcast, The Nowhere Office, which started in August 2021 and which is still going.
And what does the future of the office look like, right? Because we've had, obviously, this great experiment with the pandemic. It's changed everything. But there does seem to be a bit of a pull back to sort of the return to going into the office a lot more, etc. Like, where do you think we stand right now?
Well, you're meeting me on a day where the Times asked me to predict the trends around work for 2025. And one of them I predicted is that we collectively will stop obsessing quite so much about return to office, which has dominated the headlines. And I say that I think it's a bit of a red herring, even though people are obsessed with it, because the truth is lots of people were working flexibly before the pandemic.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, the truth is that office life is a very good visual reminder of the way we all work, but is not the majority of how people work. I mean, statistically in the world, most people are manual workers, and even in developed economies, the number of people that work in an office is growing, but I think I've calculated it's probably not more than about a sixth. And yet it's very emblematic, isn't it?
Yes.
The office is seen as work, certainly white-collar work. So it's just worth saying that of course it's disproportionately famous when in fact it's small compared to the whole working economy. I think it is really interesting to people because it signifies bigger shifts culturally, politically and economically and technologically around work.
Yeah.
So it isn't just are we or are we not going back to the office? It's how are we working? Are our jobs secure? What are our lives like? And the technology we use, which may be more of an answer than you wanted, but the specific thing about where are we and are we going to go back? We were working flexibly before the pandemic, we as in many people were.
Yeah.
It wasn't really acknowledged or named, and yet working policies in this country as well as around the world have been edging towards flexible work. In fact, the Flexible Work Act came in under a Conservative government.
Yep.
This year, 2025, is the 25th anniversary of the term work-life balance being quoted in Hansard in Parliament.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think we were working flexibly anyway. The pandemic torpedoed the fiction that everybody had to, quote unquote, work in the office all the time, because patently they did not.
Yeah.
And then you had the sort of political culture war of bosses and workers afterwards, of where does the power lie, and reasserting control, and, all the dilemmas that we have. But the reality is hybrid work, flexible work, not 5-day-a-week work is already the norm, and I think it's going to continue like that. And I think the headlines about full-time return to office are a red herring, and they're not the norm anymore.
So give us a bit of a sense of history of the office and work, because actually the office itself is quite a sort of new concept when you look at sort of human history, as it were. And you write in your book sort of about the kind of like 6 different ages of work and so on. Just talk us through this.
Yeah.
Give us that sort of chronological history.
Well, you're right that the office and, desks and then typewriters and all the sort of tools that we work with in white-collar work are relatively new. And, of course, it's incredibly recent that computers came in. So when I wrote The Nowhere Office, the book that really addressed this trend, I identified 4 phases of work. since the Second World War. And now I've updated that to be 6 phases of work, because I think that we have to look at the whole century up until now. So I think that the first phase of work has got to be the age of automation that began really with, ultimately, in a mass consumer way with Henry Ford. I mean, obviously, British Industrial Revolution had a lot to do with it. But, I think the American century of work began with Henry Ford. Next year will be 100 years since the 5-day week. Again, very symbolic. So the age of automation, let's just say, roughly speaking, it began in the mid-20s and ran up until the end of the Second World War, when the next phase that I cite, proper historians may shake their head in disbelief, although as the daughter of a historian, Jimmy, I feel I have license to sort of come up with these ideas. And certainly I worried when I wrote The Nowhere Office whether my editor, who was a bit grand and had come from academic publishing, whether she'd take me to one side and say, Julia, get over yourself, you cannot name a historic phase like this. But she didn't. So I carried on. So the second phase I call the optimism years. And they began in 1945 and ran until about 1977. And what I mean by that is, in terms of office life, I think they marked a sort of innocence, a belief in unfettered capitalism. This was the era in which the world wanted to build to consume. Yeah. It also wanted to build the institutions like the UN and so on, the World Bank and so on and so forth. It was an era in which Mad Men flourished. There was rampant sexism, racism. There was none of the literacy or care that we give now to anything, really. It was just, but it was in its own way very effective. Everybody was singing from the same hymn sheet. Everybody was going into skyscrapers and offices. Then I think, if you indulge my historical analogies, 1977 was, roughly speaking, what I would call the mezzanine years that ran up to 2007. In other words, an intermediary period. The Mezzanine is actually a novel by Nicholson Baker that was published in 1986, and I find a lot of inspiration from literature and culture, which we might talk about, because I think a lot of how we feel about work and office life has been hiding in plain sight in our popular culture. And the Mezzanine, the novel, is really about the sort of disaffection and ennui that set in amongst corporate workers that hadn't really been talked about up until then. And that period, historically, is when 2 really important things happened. One is that the computer started to come literally into the office, into office life. It was a little bit at the back of the room, and then it was edging forwards into, desktops. And that's hugely significant. But the other thing is that the politics of the workplace did begin to hot up. This was the period of time when HR policies were developing apace, where the understanding of psychology was becoming mainstream, when women's rights, race rights, were all sort of being talked about, but arguably suppressed, but they were happening. So that's the mezzanine years. Then the next phase, I think, has to begin with the internet and 2007, which was the era, I think, that work went mobile. 2007, Facebook, Airbnb, the iPhone, and a book was published that I think is really significant, called The 4-Hour Work Week by Tim Ferriss. And that was the beginning of the age of the millennial, really, coming into their own. And beginning to start to set the agenda, which is, this is a generation that oldies like me hadn't appreciated, that you take mobility and digital connectedness for granted. And that began to be reflected in buildings and co-working spaces, WeWork,
Yeah.
which I think is the most significant business story of work probably in the last 30 years, really,
Yeah, I agree with that.
other than the tech companies.
Yeah.
WeWork might have been sort of epically dysfunctional and failed, although it's still around, but it set the tone for co-working and the age of mobility. That all came to a hard stop with the period of time I call the nowhere office.
Yeah.
So the nowhere office is not an argument for remote work. It's actually a description of a phase in the story of work that I think began with the pandemic. And up until 2024, I think that nowhere office phase was continuing. But the arrival of generative AI at the end of 2023,
Yep.
if everyone can keep up with this litany of
No, I think it's really...
litany of dates, I think that we've now entered a new age, and I call that age the amazing age, which is literally two things. One is the amazing age of generative AI, which is as transformative 100 years on as automation was. No question, nobody doubts that. But it's also that we are in an amazing age of workers and employees, because you've actually got these 5 generations working together, and 3 in particular, the millennials, Generation Z, and coming up, the alphas.
Yeah.
And those really are a sort of anagram of amaze. So the amazing generation, do you see what I did there, Jimmy?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. So I mean, in some ways, it doesn't matter what scaffolding you use, but what I do think is important is that we cannot talk about the present of work, and we can't look to the future without locating it in the past.
Yeah.
I really think that's important.
Yeah, I think those sort of markers that you give are sort of really interesting. I suppose one of the things is as well, like, it starts with sort of 30-year kind of gaps, and like everything now, generations are getting quicker and quicker, right? Like,
Yeah.
and smaller and smaller. And like one of the things that I think is really interesting that you kind of write about is you're very good at kind of overmapping the cultural references that impact work as well, or perhaps reflect work. You talked about Mad Men already there, but in the various work that you do, you talk about T.S. Eliot, Charlie Chaplin, Beyonce, and of course perhaps one that's more obvious is The Office, which of course is 25th anniversary as well. But just talk to us about those kind of like cultural references that have an impact as well.
Well, it's probably because I'm really self-educated, so I don't actually have a degree, and so my curiosity is has led me to learn about the world through really reading and seeing what's going on around me, and so I have a slightly uninvested view, not shaped by, I haven't done an MBA or something in terms of the way I look at the world of work. And I read quite a lot, and I notice popular culture, and I really think that the lyricism and poetry of popular culture reflects back what we feel. And I wrote an essay for Bloomberg, who hired me to write some columns for them after the Nowhere Office, which then became my last book, Working Assumptions, in which I said that I thought that Beyonce's song Break My Soul was the anthem of the Great Resignation. Do you remember that period of time following the pandemic, when it was quite clear that we were not going back anywhere to work, that people's values were shifting across the generations, and that if you do listen to the lyrics of Break My Soul, they are fantastically potent marker of a feeling about jobs. In fact, one of the lyrics says, I'm going to quit my job.
Yeah.
And in researching whether I thought it was a valid argument, I then looked at pop songs going back 100 years. There's a wonderful pop song called Take This Job and Shove It by Johnny Paycheck that was a number 1. And obviously I Don't Like Mondays and Dolly Parton 9 to 5 and so on. But then I also realised that the Beyonce lyrics coming out in this particular moment in the history of work was really quite similar to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland a century earlier.
Yes.
After the Great War. And I thought, I'm not trying to be sort of tricksy and clever. It just is obvious that culture, which in the 20s, was poetry and now is the pop song, is all circling the same terrain, which is how do we feel about our lives and the role that work plays in our lives. And I'm a real evangelist for work.
Yeah.
And I worry in my writing and broadcasting, I worry about a pull towards the idea that we either don't need to work, or that AI is going to do the work for us, or that we're going to have a universal basic income because we want it rather than we need it, etc.
Are you a fan of Jimmy's Jobs of the Future? Hi, I'm Sonny, one of the producers behind the show. Have you ever thought, my business deserves to be in the spotlight too? Well, you're not alone. Companies reach out to us all the time, asking us to create podcast and digital video content for them. But until now, we've only taken on a limited amount of projects. But here's the good news. In 2025, we're expanding. Our production company, Boxlight, is now ready to help more businesses like yours tell their stories with high-quality, white-label content. Curious to see what we can do or how much it might cost? Head over to boxlight.io. You'll find examples of our work and even a podcast calculator to explore your options. That's boxlight.io. We'd love to help you shine in 2025. Now, back to Jimmy.
And how do you think work status has changed over the course of recent years as well? So the theory I have on this is like sort of early noughties, lots of people wanted to be investment bankers. You then have the crash and also the rise of the tech giants that you were talking about in 2007-8, and going and working in, for a Google or a Facebook became much higher kind of status as well. And then over the recent years, I think you've seen the rise of sort of the big consultancies, the McKinseys of the world, and also people becoming more entrepreneurial as well. I'd be really interested in your kind of reflections on how work has changed the status, because that's why I'm very similar to you in the view of I don't subscribe to the Elon Musk theory of there won't be jobs in the future, because I think people will always want jobs, partly for money, but also status.
Yeah, I mean, I love the way you in this podcast think about work in these big sweep cultural terms, because I do think that's how we need to understand it. And you're right that the status of work has changed. Back to culture for a minute, my favourite painting of work is René Magritte's Golconda, the men in bowler hats. Yes. dropping past the windows. And in fact, for my last book, I asked ChatGPT to do an iteration of it. I think I came in just under the wire before they changed the copyright law.
Yes.
And, now if you try and ask ChatGPT to replicate a painting, it will say, we cannot produce a work of art. But I got in that little window. And of course, 50, 60 years ago, the status of professional work and managerial work was fundamentally male and fundamentally heterogeneous, that everybody went up the same career ladder and everybody did the same job, and women were really auxiliary service providers of that work. I think the professions became very much the apex of ambition for work. They epitomised work. And someone who writes brilliantly about this, obviously, is Jamie Susskind's End of the Professions and the End of Work. Sorry, The Professions. And I was rereading his book on the end of work, which was actually published in 2020. And it is a very, very brilliant piece of work. And I think that the status of those kind of jobs has changed. And it's partly because of the co-working years phase, where the millennials started coming into the job market, mobility in work became possible. But it also is that the professions stopped paying people the jobs for life, the security started to go. Yeah. And the kind of model that was underpinning those jobs, which is you just work incessantly hard, insanely hard for very large benefits, that began to be eroded
Yeah.
as well. And so the values began to shift. And now we definitely see Generation Z, they brought the so-called purpose agenda
Yeah.
into work. And, you know, the honest truth is it's incompatible to work your socks off without a break, insanely hard for, you know, often, not always, a toxic boss
Yeah.
or a faceless employer. People want more than that. And my argument is that the pandemic just lifted the lid on a Pandora's box. All these issues had been incubating and circulating, but the emotional and physical and medical and social turmoil of the pandemic allowed those feelings that people felt about what the sociologist David Graeber used to call bullshit jobs, right?
Yeah.
You know, we all question now. Every single generation now questions, is my job bullshit? Well, that's new.
Yeah.
You can't have high status work as a sort of protected species if everybody's wondering whether their job's bullshit.
Yeah. Totally. Do you think we'll see the rise of more and more sabbaticals and things like that? One of the things I'm always taken by is Reid Hoffman's Tours of Duty, and I think that's something that's becoming particularly kind of present in sort of the generations that are kind of coming through now. It's like, well, you know, I'm happy to kind of work for 3 years on a particular project to sell my soul for money or whatever, but actually at some point I'm going to want to do something that has got a bit more social purpose or whatever. But people are becoming more adept at kind of being like, okay, well, this phase of my career I'm going to do this, and so on.
Yeah. I mean, I think the whole concept of time and the proportion of time and the shape of time is endlessly fascinating, and it's why I push back, as Americans would say, on the argument about the 4-day week, because I think clearly the 4-day week is really interesting, and you could argue that it's become the most visible, workable policy.
Yes.
But I'm nervous about it because I just don't think one size fits all. And I certainly don't think that you can say economically it's affordable, that, you know, every employer can stump up to pay for 5 days pay in a 4-day week, for instance. But it does throw up this question that Henry Ford addressed 100 years ago, which is, if you really treat human workers like drones, they will not only rebel, which they weren't quite so worried about 100 years ago because they needed the work, but they will get sick and they won't perform safely and they won't perform well. So I think what that means is when you really see how people feel about their patterns of work, they're hugely variable. And again, this is the death knell for the old professional commute-based model of any work, not just white-collar work. You know, it used to be that everybody did what they were told and everybody went to the same building for the same period of time on the same train.
Yeah.
That just doesn't work anymore. It doesn't need to work anymore. And it's more than just the unaffordability and the inflation and the cost of it, or that you can go on Zoom at home with or whatever. It's about the fact that everybody is now much more connected to the fact that for some people, they want to work in sprints and bursts of 6 weeks or 6 years and take a break. And for others, they want to work in, 6 hours. I remember interviewing a senior American trade unionist about this at Davos a couple of years ago. And they said that the 4-day week may not actually help white-collar workers, because some people like to work for 6 weeks or a 9-day fortnight.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I think this is this part of the challenge for employers now, right? Is there are so many other ways of working and so on. Whereas it did used to be the really uniform 9 to 5, all commute in, same train, almost kind of like same job that people were performing, etc. It does make it a lot harder now for employers to kind of like set the frameworks for what people need, right?
It does. And this ultra individualism is much more time consuming and expensive to work out. And I think you need some kind of guardrails, which is why hybrid work in this nowhere office phase has been difficult to make work. Asynchronous work is another way of people describing about it. But I think what matters to all work is that it's got to be productive. And in order for it to be productive, the people doing the work have got to buy into the way it makes sense with their lives. And that means it's got to be well paid. It's got to be manageable, their place of work, their commute, their management of their work, and so on and so forth. And that's really, I guess, my thing, Jimmy, my mission, is I don't think work worked very well. I think the writing was on the wall for a very long time. I think people like me were seen very much as outliers. You know, the corporate structure was not challenged or impeded by pesky people like me, you know, who counterintuitively love business and the business of work and yet challenged the premise of it. Now, people like me are understood to have had a point, which is you've got to align the way people feel and what the work needs and how to marry those two. And that is a lot more complicated and isn't a cookie cutter thing at all.
And how do you think the office will be reflected in that? Because you talked earlier about how the computer has made its way from the corner of the office to the desktop and now kind of into the pocket, as it were. What will the next phase of the office look like, do you think?
Well, the first phase of the office that's happening since what I called the nowhere office phase, so from 2020, and it was happening before with these co-working years. So the first thing that has happened is the influence of the co-working trend. So every office, including the one I'm in recording this with you, got a little bit of hydroponic plant action going. It's got a little bit of timber happening. It's got some fresh air and light being priced in, you know. So the literacy around space is here and isn't going anywhere.
Yeah.
I remember really vividly getting interested in how people worked and where they worked is when, for one of my many jobs, I was a television researcher and I used to have to go and interview people. And I remember going to offices. There was a whole trend for building extra space that were basically corrugated iron tin cans bolted onto office spaces. I remember News International had that at Wapping. And I remember going and talking to some really senior journalists and thinking, God, they're actually packed in here like human sardines. That cannot be, that cannot be good.
Literal tin can,
So I think the point is that the office, the building, as more like a hotel space, is a trend that's here to stay, more like a co-working space. Doesn't mean that every office can do it, but it means that the offices that can offer it will have a premium, regardless of what goes on in those offices, because it's attractive to people to feel that they're in a nice space. Nobody wants to work in a bad environment.
Yeah.
I think that's the first observation. The second is that the way workplace is being designed is very much more now with, again, things that have been kicking around for a very long time, but that have become mainstream, which is the psychology of concentration, the different sorts of neurodiversity or job types. We all know that engineers, for example, in a tech environment tend to not want to be in loud, noisy environments where they can overhear everybody else, whereas salespeople are less fussy. Post-pandemic, we know that soundproofing is a really, really big deal, for instance. But that doesn't quite answer your question about the office as in, how and where do we work? And it's actually, in some respects, not becoming building-based, but place and space-based. In other words, your work can take place in different locations at different times for different needs. And if you go into an office, you might not be doing so, forever in the same pattern. It's all going to be much more responsive and iterative. And by the way, as Amazon have found, as the government here have found, people dropped a lot of office space during the pandemic because they realised that it was so expensive, which is why corporate real estate has been in such a crisis. And therefore, there actually aren't enough desks for everybody.
Yeah.
So the office can't go back to what it was anyway because there's less office space, etc. That's the headline on how we're working, is we're not going to be working anything like the same way in terms of where we physically work from, especially as we haven't even begun to talk about things like the multiverse and the metaverse and, that's all going to change.
Yeah.
Very much so. We will, in fact, be able to work with colleagues and co-pilots and avatars and all the things that still sound and feel a bit ridiculous, but they're coming, and they're coming quite soon.
I'm smirking partly because you sort of read my notes for the next question. Like, you touched on some areas where you've used AI. I'd be fascinated to know where else you've kind of used it so far in your career. But yeah, also, how do we think that everyone else is going to be using this in the next few years as well?
Yeah. Well, you and I met when you interviewed me for my last book at Multiverse, which is, you and Blair's, really brilliant business teaching AI skills that was quite ahead of the curve. And we're all going to need those AI skills. I think what's fascinating is that the chatter at the moment is that everybody's going to be AI first.
Yeah.
But that's sort of only partly true. Some of it's quite a lot of hype, because in respect of many jobs, it's still about people using relatively old tech, which is computers and the systems of their computers and processes to communicate with one another to deliver services to customers. AI is being used to streamline, automate, speed up and improve. But I think what we're going to see is people working alongside this new technology, which is a little bit in its infancy still. It's not like when Word came along or when the computer came along and instantly everybody needed it. Instantly, we're not all using ChatGPT. We're actually not. We're using other things and we're learning how to use it. I think the range of AI that Google is bringing out is fascinating. Google played catch up and I think really has caught up. Things like Notebook LM. That is extraordinary to me, where you can actually, I haven't tried it as much, but I think this is what you can do with it. You can effectively load up, if you're a writer or a thinker or an organisation, you can load up an archive and it will arrange and play back to you
what do you think?
What the trends were, for example. That's pretty game-changing for a lot of knowledge work.
Is that institutional memory for places like,
Totally. But I think there's a tension going on between the commercial desire of capitalism to make money and to be in the new thing, and the tech businesses have done a brilliant job of selling that in. You know, Salesforce, Mark Benioff, has introduced a product they call Agent Force. And you think, of course they have, you know. And I think that part of this is about just getting in on the bandwagon, but part of it is genuinely the case that we can no longer work without some kind of AI, and we don't, whether that's in medicine, whether that's in back office, whether that's in call centres, whether that's in learning. And that's, of course, going to change every job.
But I think it's because you talk there about Word, and effectively Word replaced word processor, replaced a typewriter. So it did the previous tasks and just did it at a quicker rate. I think that is the interesting thing with AI, is that actually we don't know what the impact of it's going to be, and that's why it's not a direct replacement yet.
Well, and actually, there's a really interesting tech phrase called use case, and the use case is really, do we or don't we adopt? So a mobile phone has a very good use case because people could understand, oh, I can make telephone calls from this little item.
Yeah.
And the smartphone evolved from that. The use case of AI, generative AI, is actually not as obvious, I think, as certain forms of robotics.
Yeah.
Which is, I totally get the use case for a robot in a warehouse.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I'm keen that the workplace develops is a sort of nomenclature that makes sense. What do we mean when we say AI? And is AI in a law firm where it's essentially computer programming that spits out, for instance, contracts in a tenth of the time that it would take a rookie lawyer to? Is that the same as the AI that when I go to Moorfields Eye Hospital, because I've got a horrible eye condition and I go all the time, is that the same AI that interprets the scans of my eyes on the very expensive Optos machine?
Yeah.
I think AI is a bit of an umbrella.
Yes, I completely agree with that as well. The challenge for these law firms, investment banks, etc., I think as well, is, well, how do you sort of train people? Because a huge amount of what these places are doing in their 20s is increasing people's stamina over years and years of like training, weeding out those that don't want to do it, etc. That's part of the culture of these places. Tyler Cowen talks about this a lot, mutual hero of ours.
Yes.
And increasing that sort of stamina, and how those firms, those big blue chip firms, are going to replicate that in a new AI world, I think is going to be fascinating to see how they cope with that.
Yeah, I mean, Tyler Cowen's interview with you was completely wonderful, and I think he's especially brilliant on networks, which is something that, as you know, interests me, and I've written about a lot in that, and I've argued that there's much more meritocracy to networks at work than people think. There's a sort of lazy argument that networks are just elitist and jobs for friends or children of, whereas actually if you really understand the science of networks and the social science of networks, it's the opposite. And I've argued very recently in a various things, like an article in the New European and a new book that called Britain Needs Change, that this Labour government, which is desperately trying to sort of make work its killer app, and it should embrace the power of networks as a sort of cheap way of levelling up people's skills. But you raise a different point as well, which is, if we accept that we're in a different world where people want different things, the job market is less secure, people are going to be more freelance, by the way. I mean, up to 50% of America's workforce is likely to be freelance or portfolio by 2030, i.e. around the corner. Yeah. What I call the solopreneur economy. I mean, that presents enormous challenges for governments, because how do you protect employees if there's no single employer? But if we accept that the landscape of work is changing, then how do you train and incentivize workers in an industry when they don't really believe that they've got a job for life?
Yeah.
And they're worried that the AI is going to not help them but hinder them, because the current research shows that AI in a white-collar world is very good for levelling up those who have less skills. But for the highly educated, the highly skilled, those with expectations, at the moment they risk being disappointed or shortchanged by the AI. And that's a problem for employers.
Completely. What you touched there on one of the things that you are known for, networks and networking. What would your advice be to somebody starting out now in their early 20s about networking? Because obviously in a way, again, it's kind of a classic example of where it's a lot easier to do now with all the digital tools. But again, paradoxically, the amount of opportunity there is to network almost makes it harder in a way to know where to go and which networks you really want to kind of be plugged into. What's your advice to younger people on networking?
Well, my sort of obvious piece of advice is you must have networks. You can't be unnetworked. And what that means is you've got to be able to form relationships of trust, of knowledge, of learning, starting with your own family, starting with your friendship circle. People consistently think that networking is about some kind of vulgar self-advancement, working the room, getting one over on somebody else. I've always thought of it as the opposite, which is it's about curiosity, generosity, and effectively reading the room. And if, especially in a world that is going to be more remote, is going to be more technology-based, I mean, it's not even about advocating that we shouldn't all be going into the same place for fixed hours. It's just not going to be like that going forward, whether we like it or not. It makes it even more important to know how to trust your own voice and listen to other people's voices. And to some degree, you've got to do that some of the time face-to-face.
Yeah.
But it almost doesn't matter how you do it. So, for instance, in the pandemic, much to people's surprise, Zoom and teleconferencing proved to be empirically a great leveller and equaliser. For diversity and inclusion, remote work proved to be quite positive for some ethnic minorities, some disabled people, people who didn't quite like the way that networks were constructed in the office. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So my point is, it's not about any one model of networks, but it is about understanding that if you don't know how to ask another person what they're thinking and be interested in what they've got to say, that's never going to make a great career.
Completely. Do you think we should be teaching young people how to have telephone conversations?
Well, yes, I think we need to completely reinvent education. In fact, the day after I record this, I'm going to speak to a global education conference from around the world. I mean, I'm very interested in different cultural norms, of course, because that varies from country to country and from sector to sector and so on and so forth. Look, the way education was constructed, going back, let's even just go back to the Second World War, is different from the way it needs to be constructed now. And we've been having these arguments for a long time. But if you think of education of young people as the pathway to work, the beginning of the pathway to work, what are we actually teaching? We're not really teaching emotional literacy, curiosity, a little bit of dip in, dip out of different professions. We're not really designing education for work. And I think we probably should be. And one of those is the basic skills. Yeah, human skills for sure.
And what, if you were going to university now, and I know you didn't, but what do you think you would study? Where would you be starting your career now?
Well, I mean, I think one of the reasons why I've been so drawn to culture and literature and language is I, you know, if I could have my time again, I always wanted to do an English literature degree.
Yes.
I just was a dud economically. I was a dud academically. And it's interesting because I thought I was...
How were you done academically? I find that so hard to believe.
Well, that's probably because I've got the surname of somebody who was, you know, a brilliant academic. So, you know, I've got an unusual surname. So all the way through my life and career, people sort of have assumed a bit like a knee-jerk assumption, oh, she's a clever clogs because she's, you know, her dad sort of thing. I mean, I think I probably am clever, but not academically. It's an interesting question. I mean, I think I've recently, actually, without oversharing with you, Jimmy, I've recently been diagnosed with ADHD, which probably casts a light on why I didn't succeed academically, because I struggled to concentrate.
Yeah.
And instead, I've got a bit of a magpie brain.
Yeah.
So I can work in very focused bursts, which is why I've written 7 books, and so it's not really about concentration or some degree of intelligence, but it's about ability to absorb information without probably fidgeting.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the things that interests me is the system of education and the system of work properly structured for what we now understand more and more is a diverse and neurodiverse workforce.
Yeah.
I am not atypical, I'm probably typical. And if you leave aside the politics that some people think that all these labels are just pointless and useless and, ADHD is just a fashionable phrase and blah, blah, blah. I'm not really interested in that. I'm certainly not interested in a label like that being a free pass to anything. But from my point of view, it makes me realise that actually we all learn and work in different ways. And that's partly why I think there's this enormous drive towards an entirely flexible way of working. And if anyone's listening thinking, well, yeah, but, get real, that's not, you cannot have a sort of loosey-goosey arrangement for everybody. Yes, but you sort of can. I mean, I interviewed for my podcast just yesterday, Sarita Brown, who's the head of HR and communications at Virgin Money, hugely successful woman working in a hugely successful company. Virgin have had a policy of flexible work called A Life More Virgin, which is entirely based on working with what works for individual employees and their employer. So it's a marriage of things. And I think we've got to really redesign what we think about people in the systems that they learn in or work in. It's not to say that we want to make everything chaotic or hyper-personalised. In fact, I've been quite politically incorrect, possibly, or challenging on the whole pronoun thing. That, to me, was annoying in the workplace.
Yeah.
Ultra-personalisation. I mean, of course you want to respect people's preferences to a degree, but it's not really how the work gets done.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, understanding, for example, as we know now that teenagers often need to sleep in and therefore starting lessons later might be a good idea.
Yeah, yeah.
That's an example that I would cite, that once you know it, you can't unknow it. Do you see what I mean?
Completely.
So now I know, aged 60, that actually my brain works in a particular way that, by the way, has served me very well. It's probably made me a bit annoying at times, but it served me very well. I sort of wish I'd known that when I was approaching education, and I wish the system of education had been better for me. But it wasn't geared like that.
How did you go about getting diagnosed later in life?
Well, I think one of the nice things about getting older and being able to follow my own interests is I've clearly understood the link between psychology and emotion and productivity, and I've been interested for years in a human-centred view of what makes us productive, and the application of psychology and philosophy really to work. You know, my hero is my late great friend Charles Handy. I was just rereading Understanding Organisations on the train here, Jimmy. It's a book that's nearly 50 years old, but it really asks these questions. Who are we? Why do we work? What motivates us? And I had just become interested in really how I work. I thought I can't really be an expert in work if I don't notice my own patterns.
Yeah.
And I noticed that the busier I got, the more I struggled. And I noticed that I was, in a sense, working in a bit of an erratic way, kind of hyper productive, but not able to relax. And I just sort of thought, is this the way I want to be working? And I think I must have mentioned it, and somebody said, well, actually, we know so much more about ADHD now. It is possible, more or less, to diagnose it. I mean, it is ultimately a psychiatrist's assessment based on a clinical benchmark. You know, it's not quite the same as a blood test, right? But
Yeah.
it's and I thought it would be useful and helpful and might also explain some things about myself. And also because everybody's talking about these different traits, whether it's dyslexia or
Yeah.
whatever.
Where did you go? I mean, I was diagnosed with dyslexia 22 years ago now, and I think that it's come on so much, even in the last few years, that it's almost worth getting a kind of like updated thing, because I think, I mean, we're also touching on Virgin Group there, founded by Branson, of course, probably the most famous dyslexic the world's produced. But it's, it is interesting because as an entrepreneur, you've got people that are working with you, and for them to understand the ways that you want to work is quite important.
Yeah, I mean, I think the labels are both helpful and not helpful, aren't they? Because
Yes.
in a sense, if you have a label or you self-label, you can unintentionally create a barrier with somebody else sort of secretly eye-rolling, going, yeah, so what does that mean for me, sort of thing. I think what matters about these diagnoses and definitions is that you understand yourself better.
Yeah.
And that therefore, but a workplace has got to support you in that. In fact, I mean, the answer to your question, how did I get diagnosed, is actually networks. I asked somebody and they recommended someone. You do have to be diagnosed by a psychiatrist, and there's a waiting list. And I did not go through the NHS, and it's not particularly cheap. So there's that. But interestingly, pretty much immediately, I had a meeting in a very large corporate with a friend of mine who is the head of HR in this large corporate. And, we were catching up on news, and I said, well, it's been quite an interesting time. I'm reframing the way I think about how I do my work. I don't know what you think about these things. I've just been diagnosed with ADHD. And two things happened. One is that she threw her head back and laughed, and she said, Julia, I've known you for 20 years. You think this is news to me? So that was kind of funny. And the second thing is she said, actually, we've just added ADHD diagnosis to our package of health provision for our employees. And I said, well, why have you done that? And she said, because the more science understands about certain ways that people operate, their brain chemistry, the more it bears value to the way they do their best work, and we want to support it if they would like to find that out. And I thought that's interesting. So it's really a balance, because you don't want to overthink it or over-egg it.
Yes.
But on the other hand, it is germane. I mean, your label of dyslexia covers actually a spectrum. All of these labels do. So that covers everything from literally some people with dyslexia cannot recognise letters on a page. Others can read and write perfectly, but they think in a very different way.
Yeah.
One of the things I didn't realise until, of course, I suddenly started looking at all the podcasts, listening to all the podcasts about ADHD and so on and so forth, is I had not made any connection at all with the fact that I'm unbelievably thin-skinned, and despite being a loud, noisy, confident show-off, I'm really, really, really easily upset or offended. And apparently, who knew, that's very typical of this condition. Didn't know that.
No, I didn't. Well, how interesting.
So I think the only thing I would say is that what matters to me is that we all can do great work, and some of that's on the workplace. Right?
Yes.
And some of that's on us. And it's that marriage that I actually think is exciting. And I think we are at the vanguard of such a new age with technology and our understanding clinically of the human being, that we really could enter at this moment a golden age of work, but we really have to want to.
Well, that is a brilliant finish. But I'm going to ask you one final question. We ask lots of people that come on. And this is going to be really difficult for you. But what's a favourite book or a book that's kind of like particularly influenced you, apart from your own?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do, you know, he's very much in my mind at the moment, Charles Handy.
Yeah.
I think if anybody's interested in work and they haven't read any Charles Handy, they should.
Yes.
Timeless classic. You know, I mean, Jane Austen, I think it's the 250th anniversary this year. Nobody says, oh, Jane Austen died a long time ago, let's not read her anymore. Charles Handy died recently, aged 90. His books are beautiful, practical, you know, they make us think. So I would say Understanding Organisations or The Second Curve, which is very much about how mid-career people reinvent themselves. The other book I would recommend is my friend Herminia Ibarra's book, Act Like a Leader, Think Like a Leader.
Yeah.
I'm suddenly panicking. Have I got that the wrong way around? I think it is Act Like a Leader, Think Like a Leader. But that said, you know, you can't ever go wrong without some poetry. So, you know, any poetry anthology.
You're known for sort of having a bit of a media career, whether it's writing, appearing on things. Just how has the media sort of changed over your working life, and where do you think the future of it is going?
Well, I like to say that my career has sort of moved from the telex to Twitter, but even that's outdated because Twitter is now X. The telex, for those people uninitiated, is basically, think of an Abyss typewriter. It was a form of communication that you used back in the 80s. So the forms of media changed, the telex, the typewriter, the fax machine, through to the computer. I mean, my career started in the analogue age when there were 4 television channels, 3 television channels, and when Channel 4 became the big new thing. And then I worked in the first of satellite broadcasting as a television researcher in what was B Sky B. So that doesn't seem like a very long time ago, but it's a complete, you know, world away. And in fact, when I was very young, I was the book publicist for Maya Angelou, which was one of the great privileges of my life. And I remember being in my early 20s when her then best friend, a reasonably well-known but not completely stratospherically famous television personality called Oprah Winfrey, used to come to London, and we would hang out in the Basil Street Hotel in Knightsbridge. And that was all, you know, that was all a bit strange. So it's sort of not just the media that I reflect on having changed, but the sort of people that passed through it. But television and the advent of satellite television were big when I was in my early 20s. I worked at the BBC on what was at the time a primetime show with Terry Wogan, three nights a week. He was completely wonderful. We do still have prime time, but it's on YouTube.
Yeah.
I think Piers Morgan's new deal is very interesting from that point of view. I think that I wrote a book called Fully Connected in 2017 that really talked about the fact that we are increasingly drowning in medium and media. And there's no doubt that social media, where we're both the messenger and the receipt of the message, makes life really, really challenging and complicated for organisations. Not just because of what we can and can't trust, but just the burden it places on people working to communicate. You know, the website was the thing we had 10 years ago,
yeah, totally.
15 years ago. Now it's all of it. So I think the media has really completely changed. And political communication interests me because obviously that is undergoing tremendous strains. I worked a long time ago as Labour Party's high-value donor fundraiser when Tony Blair was first Neil Kinnock and then Tony Blair were leader. And I have some sympathy for politicians today trying to do their work in an environment of constant nanosecond social media where anything can blow up at any time. It's not really workable, and that's a big thing of mine, is what's workable in work.
Well, I mean, we were speaking in the week that Elon Musk has literally driven the UK political agenda via sending tweets on his smartphone. I mean, it is pretty extraordinary to kind of see this. And I don't know where the future of it goes, actually, but it's not. I don't think it's particularly healthy for anyone.
Well, I think we're also speaking in a week where Meta has announced that its guardrails of content moderation are going to go off because they're anticipating President Trump's inauguration. And, you know, as the tech bros would say in a PowerPoint, you know, we are at an inflection point.
Yeah.
We definitely are at an inflection point where not only is mainstream media changing, but the way in which messaging and personality and brand is changing. And that will affect the world of work more than I think we are talking about at the moment. And I think we should talk about it more. You know, the era of the brand in a work environment is over, actually, I think, because it's out of control. Whereas we've had 25 years of organisations investing in brand marketing. And I don't think that's going to be the same for the next 5 years, let alone 25 years.
What do you think will replace that then?
Well, I think that it's interesting that somebody like Sarita Brown at Virgin Money, who I interviewed, has a hybrid role in that she's both head of people, HR and communications. And so I think that organisations are going to now increasingly tighten the link between their reputation and brand with people they want to attract, and then how they recruit and retain the people doing that work. So instead of brand being externally facing, you know, I come from a PR and a marketing background where it was all about external facing, you know, get the coverage and the brand is everything. I think that's now going to become internally facing. And you can see that with some of the worker revolts that are happening and the rise of worker action. For instance, Starbucks, which tried really, really hard to suppress unionisation and failed, as did Amazon. In the end, if you want to attract humans to work in your machine environment, you are going to have a brand that they respond to. And that's probably going to be as important as the brand that your shareholders respond to, arguably.
Yeah.
And that's a game changer.
Super.